Welcome to this online lecture for Europe since 1848. Today we are going to continue our conversation about World War I by discussing the concept known as total war. Total war is one of the reasons why this war will last so long and will kill so many people. It's also one of the reasons why it will end in one of the harshest pieces in modern history. Let's begin with the numbers once again. World War I, which ran from August of 1914 until November of 1918, left 20 million soldiers dead. It also left 20 million more wounded. This begs the question, if the war was so miserable, why didn't anyone try to stop it? Why did they keep fighting? Well, there are multiple reasons why men in the trenches kept fighting, despite the hideous conditions that they endured. For French soldiers, the motivation was simple. They were defending their homeland against an invading enemy. For others, however, the motivation was more abstract. British, German, and Austrian soldiers fought out of nationalism. They fought for their king or for their emperor and for their country. Perhaps the greatest motivation, however, was loyalty to one's fellow soldiers. Many of the men in the trenches did not fight for their king, but for their friends who served with them. Nevertheless, mutiny did sometimes occur. The most serious mutiny on the Western Front occurred in 1917 when 35,000 French soldiers refused to fight when ordered. The mutiny represented only 1% of all Allied soldiers on the Western Front. Nevertheless, the event resulted in the execution of 57 men. Overall, about 3,000 were punished. But it wasn't just the soldiers who kept fighting. Those in the home front also kept on their support of the war. One thing that set World War I apart from previous conflicts was that it wasn't just soldiers who had been mobilized. Civilians were also brought into the war effort in a way never before seen in human history. This led to the development of something called total war. Total war, or I should say a definition of total war, is a government control and planning of the economy and social life in order to maximize the war effort. Now, it's not unlike socialism, to be honest, which called for government interference in the economy to assist the worker. Now, however, the interference is not to help the worker, but to ensure that every resource is put towards winning the war. How was that done? First, there was the military draft. The fighting in World War I was so intense that most of the nations involved could not rely upon volunteers. Instead, the military draft required that every able-bodied young man was sent to the war. Another element of total war was food and supply rationing, to ensure that troops had what they needed. In 1914, women played a huge role in the war as well. With millions of men now fighting in Europe, someone had to keep the industrial factories churning out military supplies. Millions of women took jobs in war factories, making shells and airplanes and tanks. Others took jobs outside the homes as bank tellers and as mail carriers. An even more sinister side of total war involved turning civilians into targets. During previous conflicts of the previous century, armies had tried to leave civilians out of the fighting. That changed in World War I. It was a change that began in the very first few weeks of the war with Germany's invasion of Belgium. When the Belgian population resisted, the Germans sought to end that resistance quickly and savagely. On August 23, 1914, for example, almost 700 people, or 10% of the population of the town of Divan, were executed by the Germans for resisting the invasion. A few days later, the Germans burned the famed library at Louvain and killed almost 300 more Belgian civilians. These mass executions became common as the German forces marched across the country. On the other side, civilians were also targeted, specifically by naval blockades, specifically by a British naval blockade that sought to starve a population into surrender. The British, early in the war, announced a blockade of German ports. By the end of the war, the blockade is thought to have killed about 763,000 civilians due to starvation, malnutrition, and disease. Possibly the greatest example of civilians being treated as targets, however, was the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship that often made the voyage from New York to Britain. It was one of the largest ships afloat, and it carried 1,900 passengers. On May 1st, 1915, it set sail from New York, despite an obscure warning that appeared in New York newspapers that week. Basically, the German government warned American passengers of the dangers of traveling on British or French ships, especially ships that traveled to the war zone around the British Isles. Most people ignored the warning if they saw it at all. It was assumed that the Germans were talking about warships, or possibly ships carrying weapons or supplies. It certainly could not refer to passenger ships like the Lusitania. Moreover, there were rules of warfare that were intended to protect civilians. Unfortunately, World War I rewrote those rules. Much of this was due to necessity. The Germans in World War I began using a new weapon called the U-boat. Now, we call them today submarines. U-boats could attack without warning, nor could they assist in saving civilian lives once a ship was sunk. Germany found the weapon to be invaluable in their efforts to disrupt Allied shipping during the war. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was hit by a torpedo just off the Irish coast. It sank within 20 minutes, taking the lives of 1,100 passengers and crew, including 120 Americans. The U.S. government was outraged and protested. The German government pointed out that the Lusitania had violated the rules of war by carrying military supplies. Nevertheless, the German government apologized for sinking this ship. A final part of the total war involved propaganda. Propaganda was a concerted effort to make people think about the war in a certain way. Mass propaganda and advertising was used for the first time to convince people to support the war effort. The theories behind propaganda came from Sigmund Freud, the famous Austrian psychiatrist who revolutionized the way we think about the human mind. For more than a century, thinkers from the Enlightenment and liberal movements had argued that human beings are rational creatures who respond well to logic and rational thought. Freud argued that that was wrong. Instead, he claimed that human beings could be manipulated by powerful emotional appeals. Governments in World War I tested those theories with their propaganda, which played on human emotions such as love, hate, and especially fear. Quite often, the propaganda demonized the enemy, making them appear to be murderous brutes or even monsters. In this way, modern advertising was used to dehumanize the enemy. This also made it harder for populations to seek peace. Thus, if we wonder why each side kept fighting for as long as they did, we can better understand it with an understanding of total war. Basically, add total war to trench warfare, and you'll get 4 years of brutal combat. Add total war to trench warfare, and you also get some questions about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had all been about progress and a belief that people were fit to govern themselves. That was the very idea behind liberalism. And yet World War I led folks to question this. Could populations be trusted? Could populations be trusted to not engage in warfare like this? That was one of the questions that came out of World War I. So why does World War I finally end? Well, a lot of it has to do with the United States. From the moment the war began in 1914, the U.S. declared itself to be neutral. President Wilson even ran for re-election in 1917 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But neutrality was hard to maintain. More than 100 Americans had lost their lives in the sinking of the Lusitania. Hundreds more were lost when the Germans announced that they would sink any ship that attempted to bring supplies to the Allies. The United States claimed that this was a violation of the rules of war. It also put American lives at risk. Ultimately, neutrality proved impossible, and in April of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against the Central Powers. Now, the United States ultimately will mobilize 4 million men, plus the resources of the United States. And by the summer of 1918, those men and those resources were starting to arrive in France. Ultimately, this would tip the balance of power toward the Allies. Peace came relatively quickly once the United States got involved with the war. An armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. But what did peace mean? Representatives from the warring nations met in Versailles to try and shape the post-war world. Some of the negotiations reflected the ideas of liberalism and nationalism. For example, the various cultures of Austria-Hungary were given their independence. Nations like, or I should say peoples like the Poles, the Czechs, and the Slavs were all given independent nations, things that they had been dreaming about for about a century. Moreover, a new international body, the League of Nations, was created in the hope that it might settle future international conflicts before they broke out into destructive wars. Again, this is another idea of liberalism in action. However, the Treaty of Versailles was not so liberal in other ways. In fact, it's best remembered for its less than liberal ideas. This stemmed from total war as well. The victorious Allies decided to use the peace treaty to punish Germany. Much of this had to do with the destructiveness of the war. Someone had to be held responsible for the deaths of 20 million people. Someone had to be responsible for the sinking of the Lusitania and the atrocities in Belgium. The Allies decided that the entire war was Germany's fault. Thus they inserted into the Treaty of Versailles a clause blaming Germany for starting the war. Germany was also forced to pay reparations. In other words, because it admitted that the war was its fault, it had to pay for the damages done by the war. The sum decided upon was $33 billion. Germany was also forced to accept limits on its military. Its army would be restricted to 100,000 men. It would not be allowed to have an air force, and its naval fleet was greatly reduced. So, in conclusion, let's go back over this once again. I explained earlier that I think the war lasted for 4 years because total war plus trench warfare made it impossible for either side to seek peace without a total victory. However, let's look at those 4 years of brutal conflict, and let's see what they led to. I believe the 4 years of brutal conflict led the Allies to force a harsh peace upon Germany. The Allies felt that it was their due for all of their suffering during the war. However, the Treaty of Versailles is going to have long-lasting consequences as well. Perhaps the most serious of those consequences is this: the rise of fascism across Europe. This will ultimately lead to renewed war less than 20 years later.